I'm Kyra, and I'm visiting from Atlanta. If you don't mind, I'm just going to stand so I can project a little bit better here. But this week's parsha is Mishpatim, which means ordinances, which is Shemot 21, 1 through 24, 18. If you want to turn there, read a little bit about that later. But this is about the civil laws for the nation. So it's laws for having a fellow Jew as an indentured servant, penalties for murder, kidnapping, assault, theft, compensation for damages, property protection, granting loans, mistreatment to foreigners, observances of festivals, and some religious ordinances like agricultural gifts to be brought to the temple in Jerusalem, and the prohibition of cooking a kid in its mother's milk. So while I was researching a little bit online, and I can give you the websites later if you're interested. This is from alhatorah.org. It was a comparison of Torah law with other law codes of the Near Ancient Middle East. And I thought it was really interesting. There were some real similarities and some differences with our law codes. And so some points of interest of the commonality between the law codes. And what I mean is the Sumerian, Old Babylonian, Middle Assyrian, Old Hittite, and Neo-Babylonian codes. They all address prohibitions against dishonest business dealings, false testimony, murder, rape, and laws dealing with adultery, theft, and personal injury. So one of the very interesting things is all of these law codes had in common is that when they were talking about personal injury, they specifically addressed certain body parts. So they all addressed eye, tooth, hand, and leg.
Wow.
Then some differences between those law codes. Of course, any other law code would be coming down from the king and not a deity, but our law code comes from God. So when a law code is broken in any other place, it's a sin against the state or a sin against your fellow man. But in Torah, it's not just sin against man, it's a sin against God. One of the very interesting differences also is when it comes to punishment. In the Torah, the penalties don't vary based on the social status of the person, whereas in a lot of the other codes, the penalties of different things would vary based on the social status of the person. Also, in the other law codes, economic principle prevails, whereas in Torah, it's not the economics that is of the utmost importance, but it is the sanctity of human life that takes precedence. So I thought that was just very interesting comparison. So I just wanted to bring that in. And in Mishpatim, up to this point, it's been a narrative of our story. And then suddenly the literature changes and goes into civil law and then goes back to narrative. So it shows why are we going to stop the narrative in the middle to talk about code of law? And rabbisacks.org had an interesting commentary on that, which I'll read. It said, at Mount Sinai, God, through Moses, had given a mission statement to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation under the sovereignty of God alone. They were to create a society built on the principles of justice, human dignity, and respect for life. Hence the remarkable project of the Torah to translate historical experience into detailed legislation so that the Israelites would live what they had learned on a daily basis, weaving into it the very texture of their social life. In the Parsha of Mishpatim, vision becomes detail and narrative becomes law. So in other words, civil law is what makes us a nation. And that was the goal, that we would become a nation. And that we are unlike, other nations that have divine right, or the Pharaoh would declare himself God, or somebody says, you know, God declared them king. We have law that's coming from the unseen divine, and that sets us apart certainly from any of the other nations in our law codes. So I wanted to take a look at some of the text and some of the laws that we have. So I was going to start in chapter 21:1, and reading from my model mindset. Certainly, some of the laws that I read, when I read through the parsha, do make me a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm sure that's because I'm coming from a modern mind. But would somebody like to read 21:1-7?
These are the rules that you shall set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. If he came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God, and shall be brought to the doorpost. His master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall then remain a slave forever, or for life.
So if we, you know, reading from a modern mind, obviously it's uncomfortable to read, but
Terrible.
it comes, if you understand it from the context of they just came out of slavery. So that's the context of what they know and what they've just lived. But in all societies at this time had slavery, this is more of an indentured servanthood. And so in this context, it's a financial arrangement. So somebody has agreed, and it's a fellow Hebrew, they've agreed to be like an indentured servant for the financial arrangement. And it says in the 7th year, he shall go free. So unlike what they just experienced in Egypt when they, you know, in this permanent oppressed position until they were set free, this one, there's an endpoint to it. Let's see, in 21:20, it says,
Question?
yeah,
So where did the women come from that ended up potentially marrying these slaves? Were they slaves as well?
I don't know the answer.
It doesn't specify, no.
I'm sorry, what?
I said it doesn't specify.
Yeah, because, I mean, that would mean if I were a man and I loved a woman, and the same thing applied to a woman where if they was there for 6 years, on the 7th year, they could leave, I would theoretically say, you know what? Even though it might be tough, let's just bear out the 6 years, because to have the children and the wife stay in bondage while the husband could leave is absolutely unfathomable.
Mhm. Well, I guess I don't really understand all the ins and outs of it, but it does say that he could choose to stay. So it would be a choice situation in that.
Jews?
Linda,
Yes.
I think some of the women that they captured, unfortunately, there may not have been that many women.
Or maybe if there was a woman who was enslaved, maybe she didn't have as much choice to be with him as a husband anyways. So maybe, you know, it was like an arrangement and, you know, so it's a question of whether that those familial bonds and marriage bonds held enough for him to choose to stay. If it was just an arrangement that happened while he was the duration of his servitude. There's a question on Zoom. Nelson?
Yeah, I'm curious about the 7 years. 7 is a big number for Jews. And is there a limit to indentured servant in the other codes you looked at? And what is that time period for them?
To my knowledge, and I'm not a historian, so I didn't find that when I was reading on it, but I would assume that they didn't have that. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, the idea of having a limit on, yeah, no, I don't think any surrounding culture at the time necessarily had that.
So no one else had indentured servants. People who
Well,
came for.
others may have had indentured service, but I know, nations would enslave other nations.
Yeah,
I don't know that they had the concept of indentured servanthood or not, is maybe to pay off a debt.
well, yeah, I think that's where the concept is coming here, is paying off a debt.
Mhm.
I think that's the origins of having a Hebrew slave within.
Wasn't the-
No, these are fellow Hebrews.
Yeah, this is fellow Hebrews.
Wanted to ask, what do we know in general about slavery in Judaism? Was slavery practiced as a matter of day-to-day thing in Judaism? I thought other ideologies and nations practiced slavery as a way of life, but it didn't.
I think because the English is translated with the word slavery, it kind of gives us that connotation, but it's a different thing.
It depends on how you interpret the words. So in, Abraham is mentioned as having servants, right? Question is, were they slaves or were they getting paid to work for him? It does not say, right? So, but certainly the paradigm in those times as a society was that slavery was normal. It was normalized in those times.
The word here is exactly Abraham, slave.
All right,
He's buying.
Ivan has a question.
okay. I mean, for one thing, you have to compare and contrast slavery for the Israelites compared to the Egyptians. The Egyptians enslaved the Israelites and most others in their society. It was much more brutal. It was not limited like ours was. This, as you pointed out, is indentured servitude, and it was a way of helping paupers, poor people, debtors, and thieves that had to repay a debt, and they had no other way to repay a debt but to work it off. It wasn't like you could go to prison.
It is the primary way that this happens.
So it was a way of helping people.
And also in ancient society, you couldn't just be a single person somewhere because that's not safe. You're, subject to the elements and subject to things. You want to be in a family situation.
So I guess the distinction should be that here it says you are buying a slave, meaning it's almost like buying or getting a domestic help, God forbid, okay? As opposed to they enslave them by
Subjugating.
subjugating.
Yes, exactly.
That's really the distinction. That's very, very important.
Yes.
The next verse talks about when a man sells his daughter.
Yes, I skipped that part because I thought I don't like that part.
I think we have to remember Lot offering his daughters to the mob. So I don't think anybody thought very much about women, just
Mhm.
they were,
Property.
yeah.
Yeah, I think of that as times were so terrible that was the best option that he could think of, I mean, like society must have been really, to a point of debasement that is unimaginable to us.
Yeah, if you read the Good Earth, they talk about that in Chinese
Mm.
society. If there was a famine, you might sell a girl so the rest of the family could live.
Mm.
Yeah, but I want to put it into perspective. Aleph, Ayin, Bet, Dalet is to work in Hebrew. The meaning of it is work.
Yes.
Some people were poor, and like he said, they had no other choice. So that's better alternative than to die of starvation or being killed or other reasons.
And another thing where it says in 20, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod and he dies, There and then he must be avenged. So there is something that says, that these people have a right to life. They're not property. One of the things, when you were saying that 7 was very important, I found something on Chabad.org that I just thought was very interesting commentary. So I thought I'd share it. It says, it's a very interesting interpretation. It says the 6 years of a Jewish slave servitude represent the 6 millennia of this world in which the Jews' adherence to the Torah and mitzvot involves struggle. The 7th, the millennium, yeah, it's Chabad, but it's still an interesting interpretation. In the 7th millennium, he shall go free. Jews will be free of the struggle to perform mitzvot and will instead perform them in a manner of continuous and tranquil sun. So I thought it was interesting that they interpreted it in a more prophetic kind of a manner than just a literal interpretation there. Also, RabbiSachs.org had pointed out that there are laws that have to do with Israelites of experience of being an oppressed minority. So they put compassion into the law because they did not experience the compassion when they were in Egypt. And that would be ones that we're all familiar with. Do not mistreat or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt. And do not oppress a stranger. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners. And also, do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. So I thought that was interesting that it is written into the law code to not exploit widows and fatherless. Also, if somebody wants to read 22 through 28. Go ahead.
When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. When an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox shall be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten, but if the owner of the ox is not to be punished.
Okay. So this is talking about an eye for an eye. So Rashi explains that he pays the value of the eye, not the literal taking of the eye. And Cantor Rosenbaum and I were having an interesting conversation about this the other day, about how, somebody's career is like, let's say eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Let's say you're a
Painter.
a dental model or something for a living, that your tooth might have more value to you because your livelihood is based on it. So I thought that was an interesting conversation, especially when I was looking this up just out of curiosity, people who have careers that they've insured legs or arms or something for millions of dollars. They might consider that their body part, if it were damaged, would have a high value because their livelihood is based on it.
I want to ask you about verse 4, where it says that if his master gives him a wife and the wife bears him boys or girls, he goes alone and the kids stay for the master. Isn't that kind of weird?
Yeah, we had already talked about that. No?
Verse 4?
Yeah, no, we had already talked about that one,
I
but.
did. Okay, I didn't pay attention. Okay,
Okay,
all right.
but if the rabbi wants to contribute to that, because I haven't studied the Midrashim on that. I just took Romney.
I didn't hear what Bijan asked. What did Bijan ask?
The question was about how is it weird to, if in verse 4, but we talked about it, about giving him a wife and the wife bears children, but he shall go free after his time unless he chooses. He can choose to stay too. So it's.
I'm talking about like the.
No,
say-
what was weird to me that the kids needs to stay, he goes alone. That means the master buys for himself new slaves for free.
Well, I would say that if they were minors, stay with the mother anyway.
Not how things worked in the ancient world.
Yeah.
If a man and gave a wife, then the kids would stay with the master.
That's the point.
Property,
Master, yes, exactly.
property.
Yes,
The
the
master
chain
gets
of
something for
command.
free this time. Whereas before he had to buy it.
But even.
Yeah, by the way, not so ancient, right? I mean, slavery, these things existed until, not that long ago in world history. It still exists even in world history.
There's some light on it.
Yeah, when you think about it, it was the 19th century.
Yes,
in
it's this
England
for
and the
America,
US when slavery was abolished.
for America, right?
First in England and then in the US. And we had to fight a civil war over it. As Sachs makes this point. So it's a matter of evolution. It took a long time, but the Israelites and the Ten Commandments were revolutionary in a sense by pointing all of this, by making it limited, by making it humane. And besides that, slavery was always a result, or typically a result of kidnapping. And here, the sixth commandment or the eighth commandment is thou shalt not steal. And so these laws reflect the Ten Commandments. And so they're softened, they're made more humane in most ways. And it was a precursor to what would evolve in civilization.
And just to add to that, Ivan, right? We always teach and understand that Mishpatim is an expansion of the Ten Commandments that immediately follows before. Exodus 20 are the 10 succinct, Dibrot, the 10 succinct sort of statements that we live by. And then Mishpatim is this larger expansion. And obviously there's another reference to slavery. I don't know if you said it because, sorry, I came in late, but right, the first commandment, right? I am the Lord your God, right, who brought you out of Egypt, the house of bondage, right? So God is saying you were slaves, right? And that's actually our identification in the first commandment. And one of the things that we acknowledge is, right, that God is God because God freed us from slavery. Right, and this is it.
Right, and that's why the first item in Mishpatim is about slavery. First commandment, first item discussed in Mishpatim.
Yep.
Not a coincidence.
And also, thinking on it with the for verse 4, part of it might also be because when the male slave was just freed, there's no guarantee that he would be able to support his wife and child. And going back to verse 7 where it starts talking about when you sell your daughter, a lot of it talks about how she needs to be taken care of and provided for. Well, having the new wife and child stay with the master might just be because that way they're quote unquote guaranteed to be, to have food, shelter, and clothing. Otherwise, you're starting off dirt poor and you're not guaranteed. So you might just end up back
in slavery.
So it's kind of a hedging your bet.
Although it said that if he enters slavery with a wife, he gets to leave with the wife.
Right.
So.
Well, that would be assumed that I think they would be making that arrangement together as a couple if he came in with the wife, but if they had met because there.
Right.
then one might be finishing their term and the other one not.
That's true.
I don't know, I'm guessing.
Did you want to talk about other stuff? Because
Not if they've met, but if the master or the individual sets that person up with a wife.
It's also very manipulative. Because if the slave has a wife and children, it's like, you can leave without them. Or it's cool, you can stay and be with your family. So there's some, a little bit of strong arming the slave to stay.
That could be, or it could be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if wouldn't they both have only a 6-year term?
And the wife doesn't get to go free,
No.
the woman doesn't get to go free unless she's displeasable to master.
All right, well, I have one discussion question because we're about out of time, but if anybody wants to contribute, do you think that the laws are able to? Yes,
Well, the translation says he shall leave alone, sounding as if he has to, if he leaves, he's going to leave alone. The master has to send him out. Couldn't the master, for some reason, keep him?
If he chooses to stay.
yeah.
No, but offer him a job. You're really good at whatever you're doing here.
Yeah,
Stay
that
and
doesn't
work.
exist.
It's not, doesn't say that.
Well, but what is it's the shall. In English, it sounds like a commandment. The master has to get rid of him. Is that what's really meant there? I don't know the Hebrew.
Would it be saying that he can't hold him past his term if he has to leave?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it means that he can still work for him and do everything else, but he's no longer part of the household. In other words, he has to leave the household. The master is no longer financially, because all this is the financial, nothing to do with actually serving as a slave or a servant. So after 7 years, you're out of the house unless, like you said, unless there's some arrangement where you can stay, but you still don't have the same obligations as a servant, because as long as he was a servant, everything financially, food, the clothing, everything had to be taken care of by the master. So he may still stay in the house, they'll pay him, but if anything happens financially,
He's responsible for himself then.
exactly, yeah.
And I think that, like, at least for me, right, that it's hard to not read this without being colored by the slavery system of America and the South, right, the stealing of Africans, right? And that's why you're envisioning plantations and all those things. And that's like not the model that's here, right? This is indentured servitude. This is working with a family. Yeah. Joan?
Well, do you want to go to the discussion question? Because we're out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time. We need to eat.
Hoda, early in the week, my brothers sent me, ask a question. One of the signers of the Israeli Declaration of Independence was Meyer David Lowenstein. No relation.
Sorry.
But he's quoted in an article that about the Constitution for Israel. He says, if it disagrees with the Torah, we can't accept such a constitution. If it agrees with the Torah, the Constitution would be superfluous. That argument, that's why Israel may not have a constitution today. They couldn't resolve.
If you said I'm saying.
First, different translation.
Yes.
This is a matter of opinion.
Well, I will let you leave unless you want to stay.
All right, thank you to Kyra. Please join us. We're now going to move to Gross Atrium for 10 minutes of a little kibitzing and a little nosh, and then our service is going to start in the sanctuary in 10 minutes at 9:45.